England, spring of 1943. The air smelled of oil, rain, and war. At Bassingbourn Airfield, rows of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses sat like steel beasts waiting for dawn. Among them was one that every man on base knew by name, the Memphis Belle. Painted on its nose was a dark-haired pinup girl in a red bathing suit, smiling as if mocking death itself. The name came from pilot Robert Morgan's girlfriend back home in Tennessee. To him, she was a reminder of what he was fighting for, and what he might never see again. For months, the Memphis Belle had flown mission after mission into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. Kiel, Lorient, Bremen, Wilhelmshaven, and somehow she always came home. Other crews called it luck, but the men who flew her didn't believe in luck. They believed in discipline, trust, and a bit of madness, because the climb into a bomber in 1943 was to accept that you might never return. The U.S. 8th Air Force was fighting a brutal daylight bombing campaign against Hitler's war machine. Unlike the British, who bombed at night, the Americans flew in broad daylight, believing precision could shorten the war. But that also meant facing swarms of German fighters and walls of flak without the cover of darkness. In those early months, the casualty rate was staggering. Some missions saw 1 in 3 crews never return. And yet, the Memphis Belle was different. She had flown 24 missions, and she was about to take off for her 25th and final one, the magic number. After 25, the crew would rotate home, alive. For months, the goal had seemed impossible, but now it was so close they could almost taste it. On the night before that last mission, the crew gathered in the mess hall, 10 young Americans barely out of their 20s, pretending they weren't terrified. Captain Robert Morgan, the pilot, sat at the head of the table. Across from him, Jim Vernon shuffled a deck of cards. Navigator Chuck Layton drew a small map of Germany on a napkin, marking flak zones from memory. And Tony Nastali told the same bad joke he told before every mission, because superstition had kept him alive this long. Outside, the sound of engines hummed through the night. Other crews were still coming back from raids, or not coming back at all. Every roar in the distance made them glance toward the runway, half expecting to see burning wreckage. Morgan looked around the table and memorized each face. These were the men he'd lived and nearly died with. Ball turret gunner Quinn Lowry, tail gunner John Quinn, radio operator Bob Hansen, bombardier Vince Evans. Each man carried a different story, but all shared the same fate, bound together in a flying fortress that defied the odds. In his bunk later that night, Morgan couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, hearing the rain tap against the roof like a ticking clock. 24 missions behind him, 1 more to go. He thought of his girlfriend, Margaret Polk, the Memphis Belle herself, smiling in a photograph taped to his cockpit. He whispered to it like a prayer. Just 1 more, baby, just 1 more. At 0400 hours, the base came alive. Men stumbled through the cold dawn, pulling on flight suits, oxygen masks, and heavy jackets. The smell of burnt coffee and engine fuel mixed in the air. A loudspeaker crackled to life. Briefing in 5 minutes, all crews report immediately. Inside the briefing room, the map of Europe was covered with red string. The target, Kiel, a heavily fortified shipyard on the German coast. Dozens of 88mm flak batteries surrounded it, and the Luftwaffe had been sighted massing nearby. The room meant silent. Every man knew what Kiel meant. It was one of the most dangerous targets left. The U.S. 8th Air Force was fighting a brutal daylight bombing campaign against Hitler's war machine. Unlike the British, who bombed at night, the Americans flew in broad daylight, believing precision could shorten the war. But that also meant facing swarms of German fighters and walls of flak without the cover of darkness. In those early months, the casualty rate was staggering. Some missions saw 1 in 3 crews never return. And yet, the Memphis Belle was different. She had flown 24 missions, and she was about to take off for her 25th and final one, the magic number. After 25, the crew would rotate home, alive. For months, the goal had seemed impossible, but now it was so close they could almost taste it. On the night before that last mission, the crew gathered in the mess hall, 10 young Americans barely out of their 20s, pretending they weren't terrified. Captain Robert Morgan, the pilot, sat at the head of the table. Across from him, Jim Vernon shuffled a deck of cards. Navigator Chuck Layton drew a small map of Germany on a napkin, marking flak zones from memory. And Tony Nastali told the same bad joke he told before every mission, because superstition had kept him alive this long. Outside, the sound of engines hummed through the night. Other crews were still coming back from raids, or not coming back at all. Every roar in the distance made them glance toward the runway, half expecting to see burning wreckage. Morgan looked around the table and memorized each face. These were the men he'd lived and nearly died with. Ball turret gunner Quinn Lowry, tail gunner John Quinn, radio operator Bob Hansen, bombardier Vince Evans. Each man carried a different story, but all shared the same fate, bound together in a flying fortress that defied the odds. In his bunk later that night, Morgan couldn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, hearing the rain tap against the roof like a ticking clock. 24 missions behind him, one more to go. He thought of his girlfriend Margaret Polk, the Memphis Belle herself, smiling in a photograph taped to his cockpit. He whispered to it like a prayer. Just one more, baby, just one more. At 0400 hours, the base came alive. Men stumbled through the cold dawn, pulling on flight suits, oxygen masks, and heavy jackets. The smell of burnt coffee and engine fuel mixed in the air. A loudspeaker crackled to life. Briefing in 5 minutes, all crews report immediately. Inside the briefing room, the map of Europe was covered with red string. The target, Kiel, a heavily fortified shipyard on the German coast. Dozens of 88mm flak batteries surrounded it, and the Luftwaffe had been sighted massing nearby. The room went silent. Every man knew what Kiel meant. It was one of the most dangerous targets left. The U.S. 8th Air Force was fighting a brutal daylight bombing campaign against Hitler's war machine. Unlike the British, who bombed at night, the Americans flew in broad daylight, believing precision could shorten the war. But that also meant facing swarms of German fighters and walls of flak without the cover of darkness. In those early months, the casualty rate was staggering. Some missions saw 1 in 3 crews never return. And yet, the Memphis Belle was different. She had flown 24 missions, and she was about to take off for her 25th and final one, the magic number. After 25, the crew would rotate home, alive. For months, the goal had seemed impossible, but now it was so close they could almost taste it. On the night before that last mission, the crew gathered in the mess hall, 10 young Americans barely out of their 20s, pretending they weren't terrified. Captain Robert Morgan, the pilot, sat at the head of the table. Across from him, Jim Vernon shuffled a deck of cards. Navigator Chuck Layton drew a small map of Germany on a napkin, marking flak zones from memory. And Tony Nastali told the same bad joke he told before every mission, because superstition had kept him alive this long. Outside, the sound of engines hummed through the night. Other crews were still coming back from raids, or not coming back at all. Every roar in the distance made them glance toward the runway, half expecting to see burning wreckage. Morgan looked around the table and memorized each face. These were the men he'd lived and nearly died with. Ball turret gunner Quinn Lowry, tail gunner John Quinn, radio operator Bob Hansen, bombardier Vince Evans. Each man carried a different story, but all shared the same fate, bound together in a flying fortress that defied the odds.
The sky above Germany was a graveyard of smoke and flame. Dozens of black clouds bloomed where flak shells burst, shaking the air like thunder. The Memphis Belle dove and climbed in rhythm with the rest of her formation, her 4 engines roaring defiantly against the storm. Every second felt like a lifetime. Every sound, the rattle of bullets, the scream of wind through holes in the fuselage, reminded the crew that death was always just a heartbeat away. Captain Robert Morgan gripped the controls, his knuckles white beneath his gloves. Beside him, co-pilot Jim Vernon shouted over the roar, "Engine 3 still running rough." Morgan nodded, eyes fixed ahead. "Just keep her steady." Below them, the gray German coastline stretched into view. Kiel, the target. Through breaks in the clouds, they could see the shipyards glinting like silver scars, dotted with cranes, fuel tanks, and anti-aircraft batteries. It was a fortress bristling with guns, and the Germans were ready. The intercom crackled. "Flak's getting heavy, Cap. Bull turrets reading multiple bursts under us." Morgan could barely hear the words. The airframe shook violently as explosions ripped open the sky around them. The sound was deafening, like being inside a thunderclap. Black smoke billowed past the windows, and the smell of burning oil filled the cockpit. Navigator Chuck Layton's voice came through. "We're on course. 2 minutes to bomb run." Morgan exhaled slowly. 2 minutes. 2 minutes until they dropped their load and turned home. If they survived that long. In the nose, Bombardier Vince Evans adjusted his sights, his face pale under his oxygen mask. He steadied his hands, aligning the crosshairs over the heart of the shipyard. Around him, the Belle shuddered again, a hole tearing open in the fuselage as flak punched through the metal skin. A piece of shrapnel grazed his shoulder, hot and sharp, but he didn't flinch. He just whispered, "Come on, hold together, girl." Outside, German fighters swarmed the formation, sleek, black crosses cutting through the sky. Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts came in waves, diving straight into the bomber's line of fire. The air gunners opened up, filling the air with streams of tracers. The sound of .5 caliber guns echoed across the heavens. "Tail gunner to pilot, I got one. He's going down." "Keep him off us, Quinn," Morgan shouted. One German fighter looped around and came head-on towards the Belle, guns flashing. The bullets ripped through the nose cone, narrowly missing Evans. Vernon cursed, pulling the yoke slightly to the left. That was too close. Then, through the haze of smoke, Morgan saw it, the target. The dockyards of Kiel, spread out beneath them like a deadly machine. He could see the ships lined up, destroyers, submarines, cargo vessels, the lifeblood of Hitler's navy. Morgan's voice was calm, almost eerily so. "Bombardier, you're on." Evans locked his eyes on the sight. "Steady, steady." He held his breath. "Bombs away." A heartbeat later, the Belle lifted slightly, 2,500-pound bombs falling from her belly, streaking toward the earth. Seconds later, the ground erupted in a chain of fireballs. The shipyards disappeared beneath a rolling wave of smoke and dust. The crew cheered over the intercom, the tension breaking for a moment. But the Germans weren't done. The flak intensified, bursting all around them. A piece of shrapnel tore through the radio room, slicing across Bob Hansen's arm. "I'm hit," he shouted. Blood sprayed across the console. He clutched his wound, teeth gritted, but stayed at his post, calling in coordinates through static. Morgan shouted into the intercom, "Hang in there, Bob. Medic's coming to you." From the waist, Nastali crawled forward, dodging debris, wrapping a makeshift bandage around Hansen's arm. "You'll be fine, man. Stay with me." Outside, chaos reigned. The formation was breaking apart. Smoke trailed from one bomber, spiraling downward, its wing aflame. Parachutes blossomed in the distance, tiny white dots against the dark sky. Another B-17 exploded mid-air, scattering pieces across the clouds. Vernon looked to Morgan. "We can't hold this line. We'll get torn apart." Morgan nodded grimly. "We're turning west, heading home." He banked the Belle hard, the engines groaning in protest. The bomber lurched, rattling violently, but she held together. They were heading back over enemy territory, chased by fighters every mile of the way. Quinn's voice came over the intercom again. "Bandits at 6, coming fast." Morgan didn't even look back. He didn't have to. He could hear the guns. The staccato rhythm of life and death filled the air. The Belle's gunners fired until their barrels glowed red. Smoke filled the cabin, and the smell of gunpowder burned their throats. A fighter exploded in flames just behind them, but another dove in from above, raking the fuselage with bullets. The ball turret gunner screamed, "I'm hit! I'm hit!" His voice cut through the chaos. then went silent. Morgan's jaw clenched. "Ball turret, respond! Respond!" No answer. The intercom hissed with static. He swallowed hard, but he couldn't look down. He couldn't afford to. Vernon kept one hand on the throttle, his other shaking. "We're losing altitude." Morgan barked, "Feather engine 3, we can't lose speed." The Belle staggered through the sky like a wounded animal. Holes riddled its wings. One of the stabilizers was half gone, but somehow, impossibly, she kept flying. As they crossed back over the German border, the skies began to clear. The sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light on the battered formation. What had begun as more than 100 bombers was now less than half that number. Silence filled the intercom for the first time in hours. The men were exhausted, their faces pale and smeared with blood and sweat. The hum of the engines was their only comfort now, the sound of survival. Morgan took a deep breath. "Navigator, what's our position?" Leighton checked his charts, voice shaking. "Crossing the North Sea, 30 minutes to England." 30 minutes. 30 minutes between life and death. Vernon looked over, voice low. "Think she'll make it?" Morgan glanced at the bullet holes, the smoke, the leaking fuel. Then he smiled, a tired, defiant smile. She always does. They flew in silence as the gray sea stretched endlessly below. The radio crackled, command trying to reach them. Hansen, his arm still bleeding, answered faintly. "Memphis Belle, mission complete, returning home." As the English coast came into view, cheers broke out across the intercom. The white cliffs of Dover. Safety. It felt unreal. After everything, they had made it. But fate wasn't done testing them yet. Just 10 miles from base, engine 2 began to sputter. The oil pressure dropped to 0. Flames licked the nacelle. "Engine 2's on fire!" Vernon shouted. Morgan's hands flew over the controls. "Cut fuel flow. Fire extinguisher engaged." The Belle shook violently. Smoke poured into the cockpit. For a moment, it seemed like she would fall apart. Then, miraculously, the flames died out. The engine was dead, but the plane was still airborne. Morgan exhaled, every muscle in his body trembling. "Hold on, boys. We're almost home." The radio crackled again. "Bassingbourn control to Memphis Belle, do you copy?" Hansen barely managed to respond. "Copy. She's coming home." As the runway finally appeared below, it was like seeing heaven. The Belle came in low, engines coughing, metal groaning. The landing gear barely held. As she touched down, sparks flew from beneath the wheels. Morgan fought the controls, bringing her to a stop at the end of the runway. Silence. Then laughter. Relief. Shaking hands and tears that no one tried to hide. Ground crews swarmed the battered bomber, staring at the holes, the shredded tail, the burned engines. One mechanic whispered, "How the hell did this thing stay in the air?" Morgan stepped out, pulling off his helmet. The air was cold and sweet. He looked back at the Memphis Belle, her paint scorched, her wings torn, and smiled. "Because she's got heart," he said softly. The rest of the crew climbed down one by one. They had done it. 25 missions. Against all odds, they were going home. But what none of them knew was that their story, the courage, the fear, the friendship, would become legend. The Memphis Belle would go down in history, not as a machine of war, but as a symbol of what it meant to be human in the face of death.
The roar of the engines faded into silence, leaving only the sound of wind across the field. The Memphis Belle sat on the tarmac, still smoking, her skin torn and burnt from combat. The ground crews surrounded her like medics around a wounded soldier. Mechanics touched the jagged holes in her fuselage, the melted rivets, the shredded control surfaces. It was hard to believe she had flown across Germany and back in one piece. Captain Robert Morgan stood at the base of the ladder, staring up at her. His gloves were black with soot, his face streaked with grime. Around him, the rest of the crew gathered in silence. They didn't speak at first. They just looked at each other, each man realizing what they had survived. For the first time in months, they were not preparing for another mission. They were done. 25 flights into hell, and they had made it out alive. Co-pilot Jim Vernon let out a shaky laugh. "I think I forgot what silence sounds like," he said. Navigator Chuck Lighton nodded, staring at the sunrise bleeding across the horizon. "It almost feels wrong, like the war should still be chasing us." A jeep pulled up nearby, and the squadron commander, Colonel Stanley, stepped out. He removed his cap, looking at the bomber with quiet awe. "You boys did it. You brought her home. You just made history." None of them felt like heroes. Not yet. They were exhausted, haunted, still hearing the echoes of the flak bursts, the screams, the gunfire. But as Stanley shook each of their hands, the weight of what they had done began to sink in. The Memphis Belle wasn't just another plane. She was the first heavy bomber to complete 25 missions over Europe and return with her crew intact. Back at their barracks, the men sat in silence. The usual laughter, the card games, the jokes, none of it came. Instead, they sat with tin mugs of coffee, staring into space. The adrenaline that had carried them through each mission was gone now, replaced by a hollow stillness. Ball turret gunner Joe Giambroni stared at his hands, still trembling. "You know what's funny? I thought I'd feel proud, but I just feel tired." Morgan looked around at his crew, his brothers, and felt the same. Pride would come later. For now, they were just trying to remember how to breathe without fear. 2 days later, photographers arrived at the base. Reporters, too. The story of the Memphis Belle spread like wildfire through the Allied lines. Every paper wanted the same picture. The smiling crew, standing proudly before their battered bomber. But when the camera started flashing, something felt off. They tried to smile, but their eyes told the truth. Eyes that had seen too much. When one reporter asked Morgan what it felt like to be a hero, he paused for a long time before answering. A hero? Heroes are the ones who didn't make it back. He wasn't being modest. In the skies over Europe, entire crews vanished in seconds, smoke and flame where life had been. The Memphis Belle's survival was a miracle, one that carried the memories of all the planes that never returned. Soon after, word came down from command. The Belle and her crew were going home, not for rest, but for a mission of a different kind. The War Department wanted them to return to the United States for a war bond tour. America needed hope, and these men, these tired, battle-worn boys, had become living proof that hope could survive the worst the world could throw. When the order came, the crew gathered by the plane one last time in England. The base was quiet, except for the hum of distant engines. Morgan placed a hand on the side of the Belle, feeling the rough edges of her scars. "You've done your part, girl. Now let's go home." The flight across the Atlantic was calm, almost eerily so. No fighters, no flak, no sirens, just the endless ocean beneath them and the faint hum of the engines. For the first time, the men could fly without fear. But even then, the silence carried ghosts. Each man stared out his window, thinking of the friends who weren't coming back. When they finally landed in New Hampshire, the sight that greeted them was surreal. Thousands of people lined the airfield, cheering, waving flags. Bands played. Children waved banners that read, "Welcome home, Memphis Belle." Morgan stepped down first, the roar of the crowd washing over him. He had dreamed of home for so long, but he hadn't imagined this.
Reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing, asking endless questions. They smiled, shook hands, and posed for pictures. For the first time in years, they were surrounded by laughter. Real laughter. The Belle's War Bond Tour began soon after. City after city, from New York to Chicago to Los Angeles, the crew stood on stages, telling their story. They met mothers who had sons overseas, children who wanted to touch the plane that had defied death. Every stop felt like a celebration, but beneath the cheers there was something else, a quiet understanding. These men had looked into the abyss, and somehow they had come back. During one event, a little boy tugged at Morgan's sleeve. "Mister, did you shoot down lots of Germans?" He knelt, looking him in the eyes. "No, son," he said softly. "I just tried to bring my men home." That was what the Memphis Belle had always been about: survival, courage, and brotherhood. But even as they traveled the country, their minds remained half a world away. They wrote letters to the men still flying over Germany. Every day new reports came in of bombers lost, of missions gone wrong. They knew the war was far from over. One night after a rally in Detroit, Morgan sat alone in his hotel room, looking out at the city lights. On the nightstand sat a photo of his crew, smiling, alive. He thought of the men who never got that far. He thought of the sound of flak, the screams, the endless gray skies. And he whispered to himself, "We made it out, but the war's still taking them." The next morning they flew again, not into battle, but to another city, another crowd, another speech. Each time the cheers felt a little louder and the memories a little softer, but they never forgot. By the end of the tour, the Memphis Belle wasn't just a bomber anymore. She was a symbol of courage, endurance, and the American spirit that refused to break. And as the war raged on overseas, her story spread like fire through every home, every newspaper, every heart that needed to believe victory was possible.
The war ended 2 years later, but for the man of the Memphis Belle, the memories never did. When the bombs stopped falling and the skies grew quiet, each man went his separate way, trying to build a new life out of the fragments of the old one. Captain Robert Morgan returned home to Tennessee. The hero's welcome was grand: parades, medals, interviews. But after the applause faded, he found himself restless. The quiet of civilian life felt strange. No sirens, no engines, no formation calls. Sometimes at night, he'd wake to the sound of imaginary flak bursting in the distance. Jim Vernon, his co-pilot, went back to school. Chuck Layton became a teacher. Joe Giambrone, the ball turret gunner who had once faced death upside down in the belly of the plane, opened a small auto shop in his hometown. Each of them carried the war differently. Some spoke about it often, others not at all. But the bond they shared never broke. They wrote letters, visited each other when they could. Once a year they met in quiet reunion, no press, no ceremony, just brothers remembering the days when the world burned around them. The Memphis Belle herself, though, was not as lucky. After the war, she was moved to a base in Tennessee and left out in the open. The paint faded, the metal rusted. Vandals took souvenirs, a switch here, a gauge there. For a while she stood forgotten, the proud wings of history left to decay in silence. It was almost as if the world had moved on, eager to forget the pain of war. But history has a way of whispering to those who listen. In the 1960s, a Memphis newsman named Frank Donofrio saw what was happening and refused to let it end that way. He started a campaign to save the Belle, to bring her home. Letters poured in, donations followed. School children sent their allowance money, veterans sent whatever they could spare. And slowly, the Memphis Belle was restored, not to fly, but to live again. When she was finally displayed in her namesake city of Memphis, people came from across the country to see her. Families, veterans, children, all standing before the scarred fuselage of a plane that had once defied death. Her paint was bright again, her name proudly written across her nose, the pinup girl smiling as she had in 1943. Standing beneath her wings, Robert Morgan smiled faintly. "You did good, girl. You came home again." Years passed and time took its toll on the men who had once been young and fearless. One by one, they passed on, their stories fading into history. But the Memphis Belle remained, a silent witness to their courage. In 2005, her final restoration began at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. For 13 years, experts carefully rebuilt her, each rivet, each scar, each patch of aluminum placed with reverence. And on May 17, 2018, 75 years after her final mission, she was unveiled once more. The hangar was filled with veterans, families, and historians. The lights dimmed, and a film played, black and white footage of the young crew, laughing, climbing into their plane. The sound of engines filled the air again, and for a moment it was 1943 once more. When the curtains dropped, revealing the fully restored Memphis Belle, there was silence. Not applause, not noise, just silence, the kind of silence that carries respect. People wept openly, not because of what the plane was, but because of what it represented. The men who fought, the lives lost, the courage it took to keep flying when everything in the world wanted you to fall. A veteran in the crowd saluted, his voice trembling. "Welcome home, Belle," he said. In that moment, the Memphis Belle was more than metal and rivets. She was memory. She was sacrifice. She was the heartbeat of a generation that refused to give up. Even now, visitors who walk through the museum can stand before her and feel the weight of her story. The bullet holes patched long ago. The paint proudly written. The quiet echo of engines that once shook the world. The story of the Memphis Belle is not just about war. It's about what it means to endure, to face the impossible and survive. It's about friendship, loyalty, and the kind of courage that doesn't fade when the battle ends. Robert Morgan once said, "We were just doing our job." But what he and his crew did was far more than a job. They became a living testament to the spirit of those who fight not because they want to, but because they must. The world will never again see the skies the way those men did, filled with death, courage, and unbreakable resolve. But as long as the Memphis Belle stands, their story will live on. Every rivet, every dent, every scar tells a part of it. The laughter of the crew, the fear, the relief when they saw England's coast after a mission, it's all there, locked in the silence of her wings. And somewhere, if you stand quietly enough beneath her, you can almost hear it. The faint hum of engines, the echo of voices, and the whisper of a promise kept. We'll bring her home.